All right, welcome to Biology of Cancer. In this introductory chapter, chapter 1, which I've got split into two parts, we're going to talk about what is cancer. And we'll look at sort of a wordy, kind of detailed definition of cancer, look at some basic statistics, but we're kind of setting the stage here for a lot of the chapters that will follow in this course. And so you could argue that, well, cancer has a simple definition. It's just too much cell growth, too much cell division where it shouldn't be. And of course, in a general sense, yeah, that's true. But if we're thinking of this biologically speaking, that's not a very satisfying definition. So I wanted to include this definition that was put together by some cancer researchers. They were all at a research conference, sitting around a table talking about, well, how do you define cancer? And after what I'm sure was much arguing, this is what they came up with. So they said cancer is an abnormal growth of cells. There's that, too much cell growth part of the equation, caused by changes in gene expression, leading to this dysregulated balance of cell proliferation, creation of new cells, and cell death. And these cells are ultimately going to evolve into a population that can invade tissues, metastasize, and that this can cause significant morbidity and, if untreated, death of the host. So that's a very long, wordy definition, but it does bring up some very important aspects of cancer. So what I'm going to do in most of this Chapter 1 lecture is kind of parse this apart, talk about this definition sort of in chunks, and expand on some of these pieces just a little bit. But before we get into that, I wanted to just talk some basic statistics. So, we're all aware, you're probably all taking this class because, cancer is everywhere, unfortunately, right? It's all around us. More than 500,000 people die from cancer every year just in the United States. In 2020, there's estimated to be over 1.8 million new cases of cancer in the United States. So it's something that touches everybody, and I just wanted to point out, I have my own personal stories with cancer in my family, from my wife to both of my parents to my mother-in-law, and I realize, my family's not unique, right? So you probably have your own stories, and hopefully over the course of the semester, if we get into some discussions, you might feel comfortable sharing some of those, and I'd encourage you to do so. But in terms of some general statistics, they can be pretty grim. So if you think of what's the lifetime probability of a man developing cancer, and it's basically 50-50 if you take into account all different types of cancer, 1 in 2 lifetime risk. And it's not much better for women, 1 in 3, but still very worrisome, right? And you can see it varies quite a bit depending on the cancer or tissue type that you're talking about. But overall, if you live long enough, you have a very high probability of developing cancer in your lifetime. So it is not unusual. And if we look at how cancer rates have changed over time, we've seen them expand dramatically since the early 1900s. So the pie chart on the left here, the blue slice of pie, 6% of deaths in the US in 1900 were caused by cancer. And we look in 2010, over 30%, right? So we've had this huge expansion of number of cancer cases and cancer deaths. And so it's tempting to say, well, life has changed a lot in that time, right? Industrialization, modernization, we're exposed to all kinds of things in our environment. Maybe that explains this increase in cancer rates. But we don't think that's the case, because if you look at the 1900 chart here, what was the biggest killer? Well, it was infectious diseases, causing more than half of all deaths. Whereas now in 2010, that's a tiny slice of the pie, 3% of deaths caused by infectious disease. So really the bottom line is cancer is really a disease of old age, and we'll get into why that is the case. But as people are not being killed at younger ages due to these infectious diseases, they're living longer. The average lifespan keeps increasing and increasing. And so people are living long enough to develop cancer. And so we really think that is the main reason that we've seen this big increase. It's just the increase in lifespan. And now I also want to point out that the most frequent types of cancer are not necessarily those that cause the most deaths. So if you look at number of new cases, which is up here on the top, uh, most new cancers in men are prostate cancers. Most new cancers in females are breast cancers. But if we look at those that are causing the most deaths, it's lung cancer for both males and females. And you're probably aware of that. Certain types of cancer, things like pancreatic cancer. There's a very low survival rate. So even though pancreatic cancer doesn't account for a very large number of cases, it tends to be more deadly than some other types. And just to reemphasize this idea that cancer rates have changed a lot over time, really 100 years ago, cancer was very obscure. I read this account of a surgeon in a hospital that was getting ready to, I think, remove part of a cancerous lung. So had a patient with lung cancer in the hospital, and this was such a rare event, they actually called in, all the other surgeons and physicians that might be interested to see this case, because they thought, well, we might never see another case of lung cancer, which is kind of ludicrous to think. 'Cause of course now, as we just saw, right, lung cancer is the main killer. And of course, we're aware a lot of that increase in lung cancer rates, of course, has been tied to cigarette smoking, as we'll talk about. But, as you can see in these graphs here, they're charting frequency of specific types of cancer. And we do see, some of them remain fairly steady over time. You look at something like pancreatic cancer or liver cancer, whereas others have dramatically increased, like lung cancer or breast cancer. We've actually begun to see a decline. So these rates do change depending on our environment in many cases, or potentially on the available treatments. This is also a good place to point out, we'll see lots of graphs over the course of the semester talking about cancer rates or death rates, and you almost always see them expressed as rate per 100,000. So that's very typical. And almost always when you see these, even if they don't say it explicitly, they're going to be age adjusted, meaning you have taken into account, you've corrected for the age of your population sample, which is important because, as I said, cancer is a disease of old age. So, you couldn't compare cancer, lung cancer rates in a group of 80-year-olds to colon cancer rates in a bunch of 20-year-olds and expect those to be equivalent, right? You would need to age adjust your data. So also just kind of keep that in mind. Pretty much all the data you see should be age adjusted. So I mentioned cancer rates, and in particular lung cancer rates changing due to, of course, cigarette usage, cigarette consumption. That's very clearly illustrated by these graphs. So, we see really the beginning of widespread cigarette usage with World War I and World War II, and then we see it just balloon from there. And then if we look at lung cancer death rates, we see a very similar trend. It's just that there is, a 15, 20-year lag there. Right? So that is really highlighting one of the main features of exposure to carcinogens, which is typically it takes years of repeated exposure for that carcinogen often to be able to cause cancer. It's certainly the case typically with the carcinogens found in cigarette smoke at the dose they're being consumed. So we'll talk about that in a later chapter, but that is one of those hallmarks of chemical carcinogens is that delay, often a very long delay, 20, 30 years in many cases. All right, so let's come back to this long definition. I wanted to start just with the first part, which was cancer is an abnormal growth of cells caused by these changes in gene expression, leading to this dysregulated balance of cell proliferation and cell death. Um, so, if cancer is this problem with cell growth, cell proliferation, how do we distinguish that from normal cell growth? Because obviously cells have to grow, they have to divide, part of normal development and maintaining a normal, healthy adult body. So I wanted to introduce these four types of new tissue growth. The first two at the top here being normal, the second two being abnormal. So we've got hypertrophy versus hyperplasia. Hypertrophy is where you're maintaining the same number of cells, normal organization of those cells. The cells are just simply getting bigger, so you're increasing the cell size. Whereas in hyperplasia, again, you're maintaining normal organization, but you are actually increasing the cell number. So in this particular instance, you have a population of red cells here. These are the ones that are kind of actively dividing, and as they divide, we see this increase in cell number. And now it's worth pointing out, we'll talk about this, those cell numbers should not be increasing indefinitely, right? At some point, you should reach some essentially like homeostasis where cells are dying and being lost at basically the same rate that they are being produced. So we're not just indefinitely adding new cells to this particular tissue. Then in terms of the sort of abnormal types of tissue growth, you have dysplasia, which is where you still have a normal or increasing number of cells similar to what you'd see in hyperplasia, but the organization is off, right? You can see they're not in the nice orderly rows that you see up here. So disorganized growth is how you would define dysplasia. And then in neoplasia, it's not only disorganized, but you're actually getting this net increase in the number of dividing cells that are present. So instead of just having this sort of basal layer here of cells that are dividing, you can see now you've introduced dividing cells into the rest of the population. And that really sets the stage where now in neoplasia, you do have this potential for essentially kind of unlimited growth. At that point, you would have what would be considered a tumor, right? Too many cells. So let's talk about that increase in cell number. And before we get into that, I just wanted to remind you in terms of multicellular development, which has arguably been best studied in this microscopic nematode worm called C. elegans, right? Embryos begin with a population of stem cells. Those stem cells divide and differentiate, right? They take on specific cell fates as the organism goes through this developmental process. So you have these distinct adult cell types, right, in different tissues in the adult body. You can see the nematode worm has a very simple body plan, but it's got a digestive tract and a reproductive tract, etc. And I said this has arguably been the best studied developmental system. And in fact, in these C. elegans worms, they have mapped out the number of cell divisions and the cell fate of every single cell beginning with a fertilized egg, right? So that single zygote would divide into two cells, and then those would divide again, right? So they have mapped this out, and they know exactly which cells are going to give rise to the nervous system and how many divisions there should be, and which are going to give rise to reproductive system, etc. So it's a very, very, very well studied and defined system. And I just wanted to point out here, you'll notice, right, in almost all cases, these cells don't divide indefinitely, right? There's dead ends here. So once we've constructed that adult worm, we don't want the cells to just keep dividing. We would only divide just to repair cells that might be damaged or lost. So what I'm getting at is you're going to have this balance between production of new cells through cell division and death of existing cells. So let's take a look at a human example here. And this is the organization and division of skin cells. So if we look at the epidermis, you have this basal layer, which are the dividing cells, right? They're growing on what's called the basal lamina. And as these basal cells divide, the new cells are being pushed up towards the surface of the skin, basically in layers. And as they move, as they migrate, they're differentiating gradually into these scaly squamous cells that are basically dead, dead scales, essentially, right? Waterproof, tough outer surface. And those squamous cells then are just being constantly shed off as they die. Okay, and in normal skin tissue, as I was alluding to earlier, we maintain this nice balance between the production of these basal dividing cells and the loss of those squamous cells. So once we form that skin layer, it's not going to keep growing thicker and thicker, right? We're replacing cells basically at the same rate that they are being lost. And what we see in a tumorous situation is now we're getting that increase in the number of those dividing cells, right? So we can see we actually have dividing cells up here. We've lost that nice tissue organization, and now we're producing too many cells. So we're physically going to get that tumor. So we've lost that balance between cell growth and cell death. And that's going to be the case in all tumors. All right, I'm going to stop there and I will pick this up in part 2.